Canadians generally, I think, are pretty confused about how households are doing financially. And there's a good reason for this. Media, financial experts, policymakers are often telling us a seemingly very confusing and conflicting story about how Canadians are doing financially. So my job today is to take you on a fairly whirlwind examination of the financial health of low-income Canadian households to help you understand how this has changed for better and for worse over the past 10 years or so. And the research I'm sharing today was conducted by Dr. Jennifer Robson from Carleton University, who's with us today, so thank you, Jen. But any errors or omissions in this presentation are entirely my own, so Jen is blameless. So as the headlines that you've just seen scrolling before us, you can see they tell a story that in some cases we think Canadians are doing just great. It's never been better. In other cases, it's never looked worse. In talking about household finance, however, we often hear about how the average Canadian is doing, but rarely about how different groups of Canadians are doing. So we don't hear about how low-income Canadians are doing compared to other Canadians overall. We don't hear about how Canadians are doing in different regions or how people from different ethnocultural communities are doing. So we don't get these differentiated breakdowns that actually tell us much more comprehensively what's really going on when it comes to household finances. And often the discussion is focused on income, or more recently we've also been hearing quite a bit about debt, but we're not really actually getting a comprehensive picture of all the different factors that make up household financial well-being. So that includes income, debt, assets, financial inclusion, savings. So really what I'd like to do today is to walk us through that more comprehensive picture of how low-income households are doing and what's changed. So let's start with income, because that's where everybody always starts. So income is a key factor in financial health, but market income, so the income that we receive from employment, from self-employment, and from earnings on our investments, has actually been virtually flat in Canada for the past decade, meaning that we're not taking home any more money, really, than we were 10 years ago, on average again. Market income has been equally flat, but much lower for single adults than for household generally, in particular for male adults. And we know that this is now one of the most vulnerable groups in the country. The good news is that income began rising again in 2011 after the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, but thanks in part to our tax and transfer system, not just because the overall economy improved. So on this slide, you can see the impact in the gray line, which is our GDP, our national GDP, of the recession that hit in 2008 and 9. And then you can see that there was quite a rebound after that. But if you look at the blue line, which is employment income, and the orange line, which is total income, you can see that that did not rebound with our gross domestic product. So what you see is that even though the economy overall did better, our incomes did not go up at the same rate. So the key takeaway there is a rising tide does not lift all of our income boats. The other thing that you'll notice is that really starting in 2011, as income started to go up again, is that the orange line, the total income, was quite a bit higher than the blue line, the market income. And that's because that's the difference that our tax and transfer system makes. So as we see income growing up, in part, some of that is due to our government policies and programs and investments in building the income of Canadians. The bad news is that income inequality is also on the rise. It's not rising quite as much as some people would have us believe, or as dramatically, but historically, Canada's income tax and transfer system has really helped to mitigate market income inequality, but there is now quite a bit of research evidence suggesting that it's getting weaker in this respect. So between 2001 and 2011, only the top two income quintiles, those on the right, so these are the on the far right, the column represents the 20% of Canadians with the highest income in the country. On the far left, the lowest quintile is the 20% of Canadians with the lowest income in the country. And as you go from left to right, the income groups get wealthier. So if you look, the only folks who saw their total share of income, of Canada's overall income grow, were the top two income groups. And what you see is there's actually been a drop in the middle two, and then Canadians with the lowest incomes, 20% at the bottom, actually maintain the same share. So the bottom 20% of Canadians by income have only 4.8% of total income in the country. And that hasn't changed over the past 10 years. This data only goes to 2011, though. We're a bit prisoner to the different data sources that we have. Income inequality isn't actually our biggest problem. Wealth inequality is a bigger problem, and it's growing in Canada. From 1999 to 2012, the top two income quintiles, you can see again over on the right, saw their share of total wealth increase. So you see in the top one went from having 45% of all the wealth in Canada to 47%. So that's the top 20% of Canadians by income. Well, the bottom income quintile, you can see, had their share of Canada's total wealth drop from 5% to 4%. So, and the bottom, the modest income quintile, I'll call it quintile 2, the modest income group, also saw their share drop as well. Interestingly, Canadians in the bottom quintile actually saw their net worth grow up by 38% over the same period, but because net worth was going up for other Canadians so much more, 73% for Canadians generally, and actually 80% for the folks in the top income group, even though our net worth improved at the bottom, that group still fell further behind. So wealth inequality is growing, and it's growing more rapidly than income inequality in the country. So what do we do about this? Saving is one way to gain wealth, but sadly, Canadians are no longer strong savers. We've gone from having a household savings rate of 20.2% of annual household income in 1982 to an almost record low of only 4% today. And if you look on this graph, you can see the red line is Canada with a nice maple leaf. And you could see how, sadly, we are now right above Italy, which is not a good place to be in any financial statistic, and well below Germany, up above us, so in France. So the good news is that we're not quite as bad as Japan or the UK, who've really gone off the cliff in terms of national savings, household savings, and are not showing any signs of recovering. But low savings rate are a really big preoccupation, because without savings, people have no financial cushion. So everybody in this room is familiar with the importance of assets as a key wealth indicator. But again, another very worrying fact is that low-income households in Canada have almost no assets at all to speak of. And that's probably not a surprise to many of you here. But liquid assets in particular are a very important measure of our ability to weather financial emergencies, like a large unexpected expense. So your car breaks down, you need your car to get to work, or an illness or a job loss in the household, as Minister Matthews described this morning. Unfortunately, lower income households in Canada, the bottom 20%, have almost no liquid assets at all. And by liquid assets, we mean cash on hand, ostensibly. They have just $1,000 in median liquid assets in 2012. They also have virtually no semi-liquid assets. So these are assets that in a few days you could convert into cash if you needed to in a pinch. So it might be monies in your RSP, et cetera. But with just 1,000 in median, with $0 in median semi-liquid assets, there's absolutely no cushion there when people empty their bank account of their immediate cash on hand. As a result, 1/5 of households in Canada in the lowest income bracket have virtually no financial safety cushion to fall back on when faced with life's inevitable emergencies. This actually shows up again if we look at the proportion of households with $1,000 or less in liquid assets. And the good news is far fewer working age households in Canada are in a situation of having less than $1,000 in the bank. But the rate is still pretty high at 29% of households in general in that category. But when we look at households in the bottom income quintile, so Canadians with lower incomes, we see that this rate is much higher. 58% of these households have less than $1,000 that they can draw on if anything should happen. Debt is another thing that we're hearing a lot about in the news, household debt levels being at record highs in Canada. It's a very important marker of household financial well-being or vulnerability. The good news here is that while household debt is at a record high in Canada, lower income working age households are the least likely to be indebted or to hold most types of debt except for student debt. This doesn't mean, of course, that low-income households do not struggle with debt at all. Quite the contrary. So households with low income and net worth also typically don't have large debt burdens, though. So if we look at the statistics here, we can see that the median debt for the bottom 20% of Canadians by income is $400. But $400 can be a very heavy debt burden for someone who's already struggling to make ends meet. And many people here today probably frequently see clients who carry larger debt loads than this. So the key takeaway here is not that debt is not a problem for Canadians with low incomes, but that the widely held stereotype of low-income people generally as poor money managers living beyond their means is not borne out at all by the facts. They are more prudent than Canadians generally in avoiding debt as much as possible. This chart speaks to the ultimate measure of financial health, which is really our net worth. Net worth is what's left when you subtract a person's debt and liabilities from their assets. Households at any level can have zero or negative net worth if they have a lot of debt. So it's not just about how much income you have, but it's really about the balance of your assets and liabilities. In 2012, just over 1/5 of working-age households in Canada's bottom income quintile had zero or negative net worth. So that's the blue line. This was up from 19.2% in 2005, and more than double the rate for working-age households generally in Canada, which is the green line, which you see ends at 9.9% there. The trend for all households generally has been upward, except, interestingly, for families who have incomes below LICO. So these folks have actually seen their rate of zero and negative net worth drop quite dramatically from over 38% down to close to 21%. So we don't actually know why that's happened, but we can speculate a little bit. It may be due to policy changes in provincial governments that have reduced asset stripping and promote asset holding. It could also have to do with rising household housing values. So for those folks who are low income but maybe seniors living in their own home, their housing value may have gone up dramatically with the rise in the housing market. So, but we need more exploration to really understand what's driving that. It's good news, though, so take our successes where we can. Also, the good news is very few Canadians are unbanked. But fortunately, many people with low income lack access to a credit card. Now, that can be a quite sensible choice for many households, not to have a credit card. But we know that more and more having a basic bank account is no longer adequate for real financial inclusion. People need access to credit. So we know that credit cards come with risks, but they're important and even essential tools for smoothing timing gaps between your income and expense flows, and also for navigating many everyday transactions that are part of everyday life. So if you want to travel, you want to park your car, you want to put down a security deposit for your utilities, you need a credit card. So lower income Canadians are much more likely to have not have access to a credit card. But again, the good news is the rate has dropped a bit from 30% down to 23.7%. Interestingly, the rate's going up in every other income group. So we don't know what's happening there either, but that's probably worth exploring. More Canadians from all income groups, though, are using fringe financial services. So in 2008, few Canadians used fringe financial services. And here we're talking about payday lenders, check cashers, and pawn shops, essentially. But by 2014, use of these fringe services had risen sharply for households at every income level. So you can see the orange is the 2014 data, and the blue is 2008. So there's been a really steep increase and almost doubling in every category for most income groups. The sharpest increase was actually in the use of payday lenders by households in the top two income quintiles. So fringe financial services are no longer the purview of low-income Canadians. These are being used by Canadians at every income level, and the biggest growth is in Canadians with the highest income level when you look at payday lenders. But lower income households still remain the most likely to use fringe financial services, and consequently, they're the most vulnerable to the risks and costs that these impose. A little bit more good news. Fewer households are having trouble paying their regular bills, again, interestingly, except for upper middle income Canadians. So we're starting to see a picture emerging here that Canadians with low incomes actually are doing better in some respects, worse in others in some very fundamental ways. But we're starting to see signs of real financial vulnerability in some of the higher income groups as well, which really is quite interesting. So we can see that financial vulnerability is not just something that affects people with low incomes, but it's starting to affect Canadians at different income levels. And we see here, even though the rate of people who are struggling to meet their regular bill payments has decreased, lower income households are still the most likely to have trouble making ends meet. Households at the bottom quintile are also the least likely to be able to cover an unexpected $500 cost. So this is really an important marker of whether families have the capacity to weather life's little surprises that we all encounter. So I realize that my time is getting short, so I'll conclude with looking at RSPs are increasingly being used as multi-purpose savings accounts to help families smooth out their income and expenses. So because people don't have savings, because liquid savings, they don't have a lot of cash on hand, when life's emergencies do hit, they're having to go into their retirement savings to pull money out. So you see a steep increase in the number of families that are actually doing this on a regular basis, except for the higher income groups where it's gone down because we now have the TFSA and they use the TFSA for that purpose. The problem is our RSPs were not designed to be a multi-purpose day-to-day savings account. So there are real financial penalties when you pull your money out of them. There are tax penalties. So really, we need to be exploring whether we can create better vehicles for families in this respect. So what can we take away from all this? First key takeaway is our tax and transfer system is still doing its job in boosting incomes for people for whom the market is not providing a great income, but it's weaker than it used to be as a bulwark against growing income inequality. So really, we should be asking ourselves, is it time to take a look at our income security programs, which are really built for the 20th century economy, and is it time to retool them for the 21st century? We know that the labor market is different, our economy is more globalized, there's more volatility. Is it time to do a major rethink? The other major area that we perhaps should be taking a look at is our tax system and whether we need to look at making it more progressive again, tightening up some of these loopholes, and really looking at where we're investing through tax credits and expenditures to help families save, and whether we're doing that equitably. Wealth inequality is really the second big takeaway. It's really greater than income inequality, and it's rising too. So are we really fairly incentivizing savings and wealth building by all Canadians or by some groups more than others? And I think probably anybody who's looked at the data would tell you that we spend a lot more on incentivizing middle and upper income Canadians to save and build assets than we do lower income Canadians. And are there also conflicting policy goals? Are we stripping assets from people with low incomes or preventing them from saving, even as we call on them to save more for their retirement? Third takeaway is low-income households have almost no liquid or semi-liquid assets to serve as a financial cushion. So how can we support families to build emergency savings? So maybe we shouldn't be focusing so much on save for your retirement. Maybe we should be focusing a lot more on how do we help families build up that rainy day fund so that they can weather the bumps in their income and their expenses. But how can we also ensure that we have a fair system for incentivizing longer-term savings as well? And we have the Canada Learning Bond and the RASP, which is a great start for education, but maybe we need to look at retirement savings as well. And the tax-free savings account was also a great step forward, I think, for lower-income families. Key takeaway number 4, low-income households are less likely to have debt than other Canadians, but those with debt probably need more help than they're getting right now. And I think a lot of people in this room have seen the hardship that debt imposes on families and the extreme difficulty they have from getting out from under it. So are we really giving these households enough help and a real off-ramp from debt? And should we also be looking at how to regulate and provide low-cost, low-risk alternatives to predatory lenders, as Adam has already pointed out? So number 5 is financial exclusion still affects low-income Canadians disproportionately, even though most of them are banked. Some are banked, but they're not using their bank accounts. There's a whole set of issues around that. But maybe we need to move the bar. Maybe it's time to build a new consensus on what Canadians actually need to be fully financially included, and maybe we need to go beyond just a basic banking account. And can we work on building that new consensus, even as we continue to work at removing some of the barriers to financial inclusion that we already know about? Low-income households are still the most vulnerable when it comes to fringe financial services, but we can see these are on the rise with households at all income groups. It's really important that we understand what's driving this behavior, and really, do we have the knowledge that we need to develop effective alternative products and services and regulation to help wean people away from these very high cost and high risk products and services. Low-income households experience the most financial strain, but households at other income levels are showing signs of increased vulnerability. So I don't think anybody has a good handle in Canada, and we haven't done the research yet here to understand what's driving this. Is it growing precarity in the labor market? Is it growing household debt? Is it a combination of factors? What's really happening in these households? So essentially the facts that we've been able to share with you today tell us a story about what's happening. They don't tell us a lot about why it's happening. So we actually need a much better window on the financial lives of Canadians with low incomes. We've seen in other jurisdictions, and particularly the US, and Ray Bashir is here today to talk to us about this, governments and financial institutions and other think tanks, et cetera, academics, are looking hard at the actual financial decisions that low-income and other households make, and are starting to talk to households about why they're making the decisions they do. They're starting to understand about what types of pressures households are facing, and they're starting to understand what's driving the choices and the behavior that we're starting to see in these numbers. We don't have a lot of that research in Canada. We haven't been asking those questions, so we don't know what's actually happening in households here. We can guess that some of it is similar to what's happening in the United States, but it would probably be a mistake to think it's identical. So we really need to start to focus our efforts on asking these similar questions here in Canada. So on that note, I will close, and thank you very much.